Today is our second part of our unit on establishment skepticism, and I want to concentrate on two figures here, Jowett and Colenso. Rather different figures, but each in his own way contributing to the skeptical movement within Anglicanism. You'll remember that this is a movement centered in Great Britain, and perforce, as Great Britain spread out and became the British Empire, it stretched out into all of those regions that fell under British domination. This was brought to a head in England by the publication of essays and reviews, but also Colenso's writings, first published in 1862 and provoking from 1863 onward just a tidal wave of responses. We'll see why that has colonial implications as we move on. There were some protracted battles over the requirements for teaching in a public university and for drawing salary as a bishop in the Anglican Church. Both of those were ultimately resolved in ways favorable to the more liberal party in the Anglican Church. We discussed last lecture some of the aspects of essays and reviews, a set of 7 essays that came out in 1860. Powell's contribution was the focus for our first lecture because it dealt directly with the question of miracles. Today, though, I'd like to talk about Benjamin Jowett, who was another one of the authors contributing to this. Jowett was a classicist, a theologian, a renowned translator of Plato, and late in his life, master of Balliol College, Oxford. It's significant that he studied in Germany for 2 summers in the 1840s. And at that point, seeds, I think, were sown in his thought that would later come to flower in his more skeptical phase. He was a leading influence in liberal Anglican theology, not so much for what he wrote as for how he conducted himself in his lectures. He was also a correspondent and friend of Florence Nightingale, and there were many conjectures as to whether the two of them were romantically involved, though they never married. In 1845, in a note to Stanley, who went with Jowett to study in Germany, Jowett professed a fairly conservative point of view. I have not, he writes, any tendency to doubt about the miracles of the New Testament. 30 years later, however, his thought had changed considerably. And we see right from the mid of that period, from the 1860s, some of the changes already in his contribution to essays and reviews. But here is a sketch of an unpublished work. It was never completed, but a projection of a life of Jesus. The grounds on which miracles have been believed are perpetually shifting. The arguments of today differ from Paley. The attack on them has never been combined with a profound faith in the Christian religion. They have never been regarded as the great hindrance to the reception of religion. The last century asked us to believe in Christianity because of the miracles. The present, to believe in Christianity in spite of the miracles, or to believe the miracles for the sake of Christianity. No one believes the miracles who does not believe the religion which they are supposed to attest. No pagan believes the miracles of a Christian, no Christian of a pagan, no Jesuit of a Jansenist, no Protestant of a Catholic. Everyone who affirms the truth of miracles does, in fact, assert the truth of his own miracles as the one exception to all the rest. But how impossible is this? For he asks you to believe the most improbable of all things, and does, at the same time, acknowledge a principle of self-illusion in human nature quite sufficient to have invented them. We are led to believe miracles by the consequences of disbelieving in them. Consider also the consequences of believing in them. No reconcilement with science, no principle on which you can believe them and not believe the ecclesiastical Roman Catholic miracles. And yet, no one could say that this is a legitimate reason for belief of anything. On the other hand, it is a ground that becomes stronger as the world grows older. Whether we like to admit it or not, the belief in miracles is fading away and can only be maintained by a violent effort which must revive many other superstitions. This long quotation from the from the sketch of the life of Jesus is interesting because it shows how Jowett's thought is moving in parallel lines to the thought of Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold also considered himself a sincere Christian. So the attack on belief in miracles is coming now from the quarter of people who consider themselves to be within the pale of Christendom and do not wish to be thought to do violence to Christendom. But no reconcilement with science if we insist upon the miracles. No valid principle by which to avoid accepting the miracles of the Roman Catholic Church. You'll remember that that was one of the pieces of argument that Baden-Powell used from John Henry Newman in his essay on the miracles of ecclesiastical history. As a lecturer, Jowett never openly attacked Christianity, but his students knew what was going on. Comment in a memorandum from Seymour about a conversation he had with Jowett. He quotes Jowett as saying, "Religion is not dependent upon historical events, the report of which we cannot altogether trust." And this vein of silent skepticism ran through his teaching. That provoked some serious doubts. In 1855, he was appointed professor of Greek, and he was denounced by a couple of members of Convocation as having denied the Catholic faith. Catholic here not meaning Roman Catholic, but the general faith, which for an Anglican is encoded in the 39 Articles. 39 Articles of Faith are fairly explicit doctrinal articles, rather Calvinistic in their surface reading, and certainly quite openly avowing the supernatural. The professor was summoned to appear before the vice-chancellor and to sign the articles anew. He appeared in answer to the summons, and the vice-chancellor Cotton began to address him solemnly on the awfulness of his situation. Jowett cut him off with the words, "Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I have come to sign the articles." Dr. Cotton recommenced his harangue. In reply, as tradition has it, Jowett simply asked for a new pen and wrote his signature without another word. Samuel Green, who quotes, or from whom this story is taken, is not altogether approving of Jowett. He gives this as an illustration of how you might have a creed and have people subscribing to that creed and yet not sincerely be believers of it. Here's a quotation from Atlay's Memoirs of Sir Henry Wentworth Acland. "A most learned and amiable man exercised extraordinary influence on the education of the most advanced college in Oxford. He led his pupils quietly on to the negation of all creeds, not because he was an unbeliever in the vulgar sense of the word, but because his peculiar mode of criticism cut the very sinews of belief. The effect of his peculiar teaching may be traced in many a refined mind of the present day." If Jowett was working quietly and behind the scenes, Colenso was working quite openly and directly. He was a mathematician and Anglican bishop of Natal in South Africa, and his book, The Pentateuch and the Book of Joshua Critically Examined, which came out in 1862, was published in a run of 2,000, which sold out immediately, causing the publisher to put together another run of 7,000, was wildly popular and wildly hated. Just last evening, I was trying to put together a rough list of the responses to Colenso. I'm sure I did not find even half of them, and as John can attest, I did find at least, 3 dozen? It's an enormous cataract of responses to Colenso, and I was only taking notice of things that came out as books, many of them in 1863, so an immediate response. This was a flashpoint in the 19th century to rival some of those of the deist controversy. Colenso's position on the Pentateuch is interesting, not because there's much novelty in it. There are a few novel objections, but most of them are actually borrowed from earlier works. Notice the words critically examined in the title of his work. That has to have reminded many people of the title of Strauss's Life of Jesus from 1835. Das Leben Jesu kritisch bearbeitet, critically worked at, critically examined. it was no doubt a deliberate move on Colenso's part to use that phrase, and a deliberate echo of Strauss. It did not win him any favors among the more conservative party in the Anglican Church. He holds that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. It's a composite work, but that's really a secondary issue. The main thrust of his work is contained in this quotation from page 60. The books of the Pentateuch contain in their account of the story which they profess to relate such remarkable contradictions and involve such plain impossibilities that they cannot be regarded as true narratives of actual historical matters of fact. Again, the scandal was not the novelty of Colenso's objections. Many of those objections were old. The scandal was that someone who was not only a clergyman, but a bishop with care of souls on the eastern coast of South Africa, in Zululand, as it was called, should be openly attacking the Pentateuch. Now, it's interesting, some of the lines of argument that people used. One line of argument that is brought forth in many works is Jesus expressly attributes the Pentateuch to Moses. Therefore, to criticize the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch is to criticize Jesus. Colenso's response was that Jesus grew in his understanding and may not actually have known this, humanly considered, right? The human side of Jesus may have restricted his knowledge, and in any event, he spoke in the language that was accommodated to the day in which he lived. Those responses satisfied some people, but not most. Might be useful here just to give you a really brief bird's eye view of the history of the higher criticism of the Pentateuch. It's normally thought to have begun with the deist controversy, or perhaps a little bit earlier, reaching back into some Jewish writers like Aben Ezra and Spinoza. But although the criticisms of alleged contradictions in the Old Testament, and the Pentateuch in particular, were fielded by many writers, they were considered by many of the old Talmudic commentators, Bolingbroke, Voltaire, Tyndall, and others rehearsed some of those. They really came to a point when a French physician named Astruc wrote his conjectures on the sources of the original memoranda that were used to construct the Pentateuch. And Astruc's views were picked up and given currency in Germany in the latter part of the 18th century by people like Eichhorn and Ilgen. They really got to town on this. Ilgen divided, for example, Genesis chapter 30 into 44 portions. There are 19 from the first Elohist, 18 from the second Elohist, and 7 from the Jehovahist, or the Yahwehist, as it would later be called. But in the 19th century, it was Graf and particularly Wellhausen who made this view mainstream and devoted a lot of their energy to it. It's very significant to note the extensive use of the argument from silence in this kind of higher criticism. Wellhausen, defending Graf, says that it is nothing more or less than the universally valid method of historical investigation, that if one author is silent about something, where we think he ought to have said something if he knew about it, then that may be taken as a contradiction of a different author who claims that some event transpired. The chief arguments in this school of thought for the composite authorship of the Pentateuch, and consequently for denying its Mosaic authorship, are 4 in number. First, diversity of names. In various passages, we have Elohim and Jehovah used as names for God, and there seems to be a certain amount of clustering of these. The argument from the continuity of each document. If we extract the Elohistic passages, we can reconstruct a document that flows reasonably well and doesn't have many notable gaps. Sometimes also claimed for the Yahwehistic document, that's much harder to sell. And the more different writers we separate it into, the more difficult it becomes to say, well, this is a document with some continuity. But that was the claim in any event. Third, parallel passages. Some passages appear to tell us the same story twice. Say, the story of the flood, once using Elohim, once using Jehovah. Most notably, the story of creation from Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 in Elohistic terms, if I'm not flipping that, and then in Genesis 2:4, Yahwehistic terms. Now, it's very important to remember that all of this argument from names is predicated on the assumption that the names of God are simply designators. They don't carry specific meaning, and therefore they are interchangeable. So the only reason that one writer would use one of them in preference to the other is a stylistic preference, not a desire to stress something, as, for example, about the attributes of God denoted by the name Jehovah. With that assumption in place, the claim is that the extracted, reconstructed documents exhibit a diversity of style, diction, ideas, and aim. It's beyond the scope of this class to pursue the question of whether these arguments are cogent, although I would direct you in particular, if you're interested in seeing a critical view of them, to William Henry Green's book, The Higher Criticism of the Pentateuch. John may be able to find that in our database and give a link to that. I have found Green to be probably the best of the older writers on this subject, or one of the best. Now, ideas about authorship and the dissection of classical works had been floated in classics in the late 18th and early 19th century, and they had more or less laid waste to a wide swath of the field. Here's from Bancroft's History, quoted in MacDill's response to Colenso. There has been left hardly one eminent author of antiquity who has not been cheated out of part of his fame. Sophocles is made to give up one of his plays, Plato half of his dialogues, Anacreon almost all his odes, and the Iliad and Odyssey are declared to be full of interpolations, the shreds and rags of audacious sophists patched upon the simple and majestic robes of Homer. Curiously, Benjamin Jowett was one of the conservatives when it came to the attribution of authorship to the dialogues customarily attributed to Plato. He argued in many cases that the dialogues had been correctly attributed, that the arguments against the attribution were not very strong, and so forth. And yet, when it came to the Old Testament, at least late in his career, he was more than happy to allow similar arguments to wash away the traditional view. That appearance of inconsistency in his thought was remarked on by some of his commentators. So Henry Rogers, for example, wrote a sarcastic book, very much in the spirit of Richard Whately, entitled A Vindication of Bishop Colenso, in which he argues that Colenso can't be blamed for the things that are attributed to him because we can prove by an internal examination of Colenso's own book that it's impossible that it should have been the work of one writer, and clearly there were different factions with different ideologies who contributed different strands to Colenso's book on the Pentateuch. If you're interested in that use of sarcasm as a device in the controversial wars of the 19th century, then Rogers' work is one that you might want to look at. John, do we have a copy of Rogers? Okay. Colenso's forthright, skeptical claims drew the unfavorable attention of a large number of members of the Anglican Church. The South African bishops convened hastily, and late in 1863, they deposed him. He appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London. They said, well, look, the South African bishops really don't have jurisdiction here. We're not going to take a position on whether his book is heretical, but you really don't have the right to kick him out. Meanwhile, they consecrated a rival bishop. Missionary societies withdrew their contributions to the work in Natal. At the Lambeth Conference in 1867, the third day of deliberations was given over to what to do about Colenso. I believe it was a resolution put forward by someone from Vermont in the United States, resolved to regard the said Dr. John William Colenso as a heretic, cut off from the communion of the church. The division of the vote, which rejected the motion, came out in a very interesting way. All but one of the English bishops voted to reject the motion, a show of some solidarity with Colenso. Almost all of the American and colonial bishops supported the motion, which tells you also something about the way that the Lambeth Conference was stacked and who had the majority of the votes in their hand. In the end, Colenso retained his episcopal income and control of the cathedral in Pietermaritzburg. His rivals gathered funds and constructed a cathedral of their own to set up in opposition to his cathedral, and so the matter dragged itself out until his death. Here's the resolution number 6 from Lambeth that was actually adopted. Note that they are essentially punting on the issue. Resolved that in the judgment of the bishops now assembled, the whole Anglican communion is deeply injured by the present condition of the church in Natal. Not a word about who's responsible for that condition. Simply, the Anglican communion is injured by the present condition of the church in Natal. Different people voting for this resolution could interpret those words to suit their own preferred interpretation. And that a committee be now appointed at this general meeting to report on the best mode by which the church may be delivered from the continuance of this scandal and the true faith maintained. That such report be forwarded to His Grace, the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, with the request that he will be pleased to transmit the same to all the bishops of the Anglican Communion and to ask for their judgment thereupon. In other words, we will do nothing, but we will wring our hands and make distressed noises about the controversy. There were other currents, however, in Anglican thought, and currents that had bearing upon the movement, both to undermine the subscription to the 39 Articles as a test for teaching in the great British universities, and on the influx of the higher criticism. Just to give you two glimpses through a rarely used window here, I want to talk about two poets. William Wordsworth wrote a letter in 1834 to the scientist William Whewell, thanking him for his Bridgewater Treatise, it's a work of natural theology, and then bringing up the question of a petition to abolish the subscription to the Articles, which he says he is informed that Whewell has signed, and he's rather distressed with that. He describes in what he casts as a dream a scene in which the young men and the younger professors are smashing down the buttresses of a church because they're old-fashioned and the church doesn't need them, and they go about it quite vigorously. And when all this destruction is done, the whole church comes crashing down on top of them. These are the ill consequences that he foresees if the religious tests at Cambridge are abolished. From later in the 19th century, the poet Robert Browning wrote quite an interesting and moving poem called A Death in the Desert. It's about the death of John the Evangelist in his old age, and he imagines doubtful inquirers asking, was John at all? And did he say he saw? Assure us ere we ask what he might see. Browning was relatively conservative for his time, as was Wordsworth. So it's interesting to see the poets coming in indirectly, but touching on these questions, and Wordsworth very concerned that the established church not be eliminated, Browning concerned that the influx of skepticism might actually lead us to the point where we would doubt whether there was a John at all, and whether he saw, and what he said, if he did. One other cross-current, going back here to the year 1832, the Halcyon Lectures. I've mentioned Blount's Undesigned Coincidences, and this work later was incorporated as a part of the omnibus volume of Undesigned Coincidences from, I believe, the 1840s onward. This set of Halcyon Lectures was entitled The Veracity of the Historical Books of the Old Testament, from the conclusion of the Pentateuch to the opening of the prophets, argued from the undesigned coincidences to be found in them, when compared in their several parts. This is a continuation of an argument that he had put forward in, I believe, the previous year's Halcyon Lectures on the veracity of the 5 books of Moses. So Blount was taking the argument from undesigned coincidences, from those incidental interlockings in which one passage explains another without any appearance that it was crafted to explain the other, and says that these argue for the substantial historicity of the documents of the Old Testament as well as of the New Testament. So there was a line of thought paralleling the critical line of thought that was being brought in by people like Colenso and made public and popular by him, that was quietly pulling the other direction. So if this is an area that interests you, don't neglect to go back and see the divergence of views. Thomas Rawson Burks is another person who works in the same vein as Blount, and in fact, Wordsworth's letter to William Whewell specifically mentions that a young man by the name of Burks gave a sermon which Wordsworth heard, and it cheered him greatly to think that there were young men of such sentiments who were rising through Cambridge University. That's an extremely short time to give to an extremely long controversy.